Hello, happy Monday. I hope you are doing well. I have caught my son's cold, and so I am currently going like this, but that's okay. It's Monday, and we're going to make it through. So, wanted to jump in and talk about bar charts, something that shows up a lot in a lot of our math and science and social studies classrooms as we are working with data to spend a little bit of time thinking about, we call them bar charts. But there are actually a lot of different ways that we are graphing and making sense of things. And I wanted to showcase a couple really cool books that are out there that are possibilities to bring into your classrooms, especially our elementary and middle school classrooms, as ways to kind of make connections. And we'll share out a couple resources through CodeApp and just sort of to give a shout out of like thinking about these different kinds of graphs. Okay, that we like all often call like a bar chart, as if it's one thing. So first example of our bar chart is going to come from this fantastic book, Barnaby's Barchart's Beach Adventure, where you get to go along with different characters through the book. But the reason why I wanted to pick this one first is because that this is a really common way that our littles make bar charts. In other words, they sort of make a count. They have a count of how many different items or observations they've made across different categories. So here's what it can look like. Let me make sure you can see. So for each of those different characters, they have different blocks to indicate how many items they have. So the height of the bar is indicative of the number of observations, or in other words, sort of the frequency or the count of how many, in this case, each category is a different character, each category has. Now, as you can see in this rendition, in this great book by Liv Buli and illustrated by Mark Carey, shout out to them, this can also be our icons. This can be our pictures for our pictograph. The key thing here is that it actually doesn't really matter what's in here. It can all be one bar, but that bar height represents the frequency or the observations. This is how we can make this distinction of it can be dots, it can be pictures, it can be icons, or we actually can even represent it with bars, where the height of the bar indicates the number of observations. So this, in essence, is where we have made a bar. Yes, these are bars, but the bar height indicates the observations, the frequency, the count that we have observed for each of the categories. Okay, so this is one kind. Again, shout out to the author and illustrator here. Okay, now let's think about a different kind that we can have. Sometimes we have different categories or different situations, right? When we're looking at a bar chart, we are comparing between categories. That is really key component. We are comparing between categories. We are not looking at a sequential number sequence. We are comparing between distinct categories. And we have measured values in each of those distinct categories. So here my example is, this one's hot off the presses, Daphne Draws Data. There are all these fun characters in this one. And here there is an example of polar bears. So which polar bear can dive the deepest? So each of these categories, in essence, is an individual polar bear, and they have a depth that they can go. Now, just remember, we go down in the water. So we're in the bottom right-hand quadrant of our graph. It's always good to show kids graphs, not only in the top right-hand quadrant of the 4 quadrants of our graph. So that, yes, that is why the bars are going down here. But here, the length of the bar or the depth of the bar indicates the value, the measured value for that particular polar bear, for that particular category. Okay, so this is different than how many observations we made in that category. That's a value for an individual, and then we're representing that with the bar. One might wonder what that actually tells us, what we're doing, but that's a whole nother thing. But what you can see is so what you're then doing is you're comparing you're looking at deep or the length or which is longer, which is shorter across them to get a sense. Now, I said like we can sort of decide if that's like worth it, because it might also be helpful just to sort of look at this along a dot line and sort of see comparisons across, but whatever. So here the bar is representing the value for that particular category. Now, what if as we move forward, we start collecting more values? And yes, please, all of our students should collect more data values, measure more values for each category. So it's not that we have just one, because in essence, our variable here is polar bears. So so we can look at this as we can compare these 5 polar bears, or what if we were wanting to compare polar bears to sea lions? And then we have 5 replicates or 5 samples of our polar bears, and we want to compare those 5 in the group of polar bears against 5 sea lions, for example. I've moved off of the book, but this is the book. It was written by Cole Nussbaumer Knaflic and illustrated by John Skewers. I will put a link to this, with the caveat that all of these books have some interesting definitions of graphs and different things like that. But they are great to help kids look and just take it all with a grain of salt. Okay, so if we then have categories and we have multiple measurements, then we have our students calculate the means and the averages. And then what they're making is the height of the bar is the average that they've calculated. So now what am I showing you? Okay, so this is Exemplary Evidence, Scientists and Their Data by Jessica Fries-Gaither, illustrated by Linda Oliver. And in the back, they have this great sort of 4-part steps of how you can collect your own data. And it lists make a graph of average. So now the bar height is the average of the measured values that were taken for that category. So each of these is slightly different in terms of what data is going in to create the height of that bar. And here's the catch. It therefore influences how we make sense of the data. Now, the tricky thing is that very often our students look at a bar chart, regardless of what kind of bar chart it is, and think of it as either that frequency or that count one that I was first showing you, or that it's just the actual value. But we want our students to be moving towards, and they get there in middle school and really beyond middle school, the height of that bar is influenced by all of the data points in the group for that category. So they need to be thinking about it as a representation of the total of the group, not as an absolute value of a measurement or of a number of count. That differs in how we make claims from the heights of the bars and different things like that. So yes, there are different ways that we actually make those bar heights. Yes, they are important as our students are scaffolding through from our littles in kindergarten and pre-K, making those frequency count bars into measured value bars, into the bar actually represents multiple measurements for that group. It should have, some sign of the variability within our data, but we can get to that next week. But also there are some great books out there that we can be using and bringing in and showcasing with our students and different things like that as a way to bring in this data knowledge. So just a little tip of the difference between these different kinds of bars, and that it makes a difference in how our students are going to look at that and interpret it and draw a claim from it. And if they are thinking count or just a single measured variable, they're going to be thinking very mathematically of think subtraction, which is higher than the other. And we need to get them thinking about the category as a group, as an overall, when the height of that bar is an average that they are looking at. So the absolute difference doesn't matter as much as in general, how do the groups compare to one another? I hope you all have a wonderful week in wherever you are, in whatever weather is coming your way and all of those things. I'm going to try to drink lots of tea and not get taken down by this cold, and I'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone.